We're going to talk about nitrogen management, and we want to do better. We want to make money. We want to protect the environment. And you can do a number of things by choosing the fertilizer material, how and when you put it out, and how much you put out. And I'm going to concentrate on the rate aspect. So in Indiana, we have people still put fall nitrogen out. We have early spring nitrogen. Probably about half of our folks side dress. And almost everything I'm going to talk about was either at planting nitrogen or side dress up to about V9. So I'm going to talk about situations which generally you have the least potential for loss. So we're not going to. There's so much uncertainty in nitrogen, determining nitrogen rate, that if we start getting further and further away from the planting time, the uncertainty just begins to compound and becomes even more difficult. I'm going to talk about research that we did in Indiana, and then some research that I was a part of that was conducted in 8 states throughout the Corn Belt, and I'm going to go back and forth, and hopefully I'll be slow enough and thorough enough that you understand each time what I'm talking about. So Steve talked about the tri-states, and he skipped the nitrogen part. If you go back to that document, we have a yield goal-based nitrogen recommendation system, and we'll see what it was in a minute. But that yield-based approach was first suggested in 1966 by a professor with the USDA in Beltsville, Maryland. And he said that the fertilizer recommendation equaled the yield times the nitrogen factor at harvest minus the amount of soil nitrogen that was contributed divided by the efficiency of fertilizer use. So the target is how much nitrogen is in the plant at the end of the year, and it was based on some form of an expected yield or a yield goal or an anticipated yield or the mean of the average of the last 5 years or the average of the last 5 years plus 10% or the average of the last 5 years minus the high and the low. So there are a lot of different approaches to that. A lot of times, in my experience, is what the farmer hoped to make. And some people thought the farmer was sometimes overly ambitious. And then times the nitrogen concentration in the above ground plant at maturity. And that's expressed on a bushel of grain basis. And so that often that nitrogen factor was 1.2 pounds of N per bushel. And that's the most common approach, or the common number. As Harold said, if you wanted a number, you'd multiply the yield, expected yield, times that 1.2 pounds of N per bushel. And it always struck me that when I talk, people say, well, you're showing us old research. It got so bad that a couple of years ago, I showed research from 3 years before, and somebody said, well, you know, hybrids today are way different than they were 3 years ago. You need to do this again. But people really were wedded to this 1.2 pounds of N per bushel number. And if you go back and look at the research, it was based on experiments conducted just after World War II through 1960. Some of the varieties of corn were open-pollinated populations. And Midwesterners, most of the work was conducted in the South. And then a few studies later in Nebraska. But this has been one of the numbers that's hardest to overcome. People just want to say, what's the number? Is it still 1.2 pounds N per bushel? So that's the origin of that. Tri-State was a little different, and I was not in the room when this was determined, but I did go back and find, I believe in Indiana, the first instance of this yield goal approach was 1968, and the equation is the target nitrogen in pounds per acre is minus 27 plus 1.36 times the yield potential. So for some reason they didn't use the 1.2 minus a nitrogen credit. And we usually think about soybean, and the N credit was 30 pounds of N per acre. So if you look at a corn in rotation with soybean, the soil contribution is about 57 pounds of nitrogen per acre. So remember, in the original equation, there was you subtracted off what the soil was going to provide. And they cited some work that was done in the Midwest that found approximately this amount of nitrogen was contributed by the soil on average. And there was no fertilizer efficiency factor that was obviously in this equation. So it could have been one of the reasons they changed this factor, but it was a little different than what the intention is. And if you look around the country, for the most part, none of the states that use the yield goal approach use a fertilizer efficiency factor. And this by far is the most popular if you look at it on a state basis. I think it's about 40 of the states use this yield goal approach. Ohio, Indiana, and several other Corn Belt states now use an MRTN approach, or an approach that we'll look at later that's based on the results of a number of experiments. And that represents, I think there's eight states in there. It represents about 2/3 of the corn grown in the United States. So we've no longer used this method, but I'm going to talk a lot about it. And the reason I'll talk about it is basically the approach that's used in the models that have become popular in the last few years and are probably going to become eventually, Dr. McGrath, maybe eventually, a good way of making N recommendations. So we'll talk a little bit about three of these components. We're not going to get into the efficiency aspect, but we'll talk about predicting crop yield, plant N content associated with crop yield, and then soil mineralization. And I'm basically going to show you where the uncertainty is and how much uncertainty there, the magnitude of that uncertainty. We're going to do the best job we can managing nitrogen, but it's never going to be perfect. And we really got to come to grips with how good we're going to be. How close can we get it? So just to show you how unpredictable yield is, or how difficult or variable yield is, I have 4 fields here. This is in the prairie soils in near West Lafayette, near the Purdue campus, and this is up north near Valparaiso. The numbers just represent the fields. These experiments were done in 2006 through 2009. For every site, the same hybrid was used for 3 years across all sites, and then for the other 2 years, a different hybrid was used, but it was consistent across all sites. And the practices are very similar, about 30 to 34,000 plants per acre, side dress sometime between V3 and V7 with UAN, a little bit of starter fertilizer, usually about 25 pounds of nitrogen, et cetera. So everything is managed pretty similarly. But the soils are different, and of course the seasons are different. These are our best soils in our least variable. And this represents the range in yield at these locations. Now, I took out 2012 here at the acre farm because of the severe drought, which hopefully is not going to be occurring very frequently. So these were all reasonably good years. And you see the range in bushels per acre is varying within this one field from season to season: 29 bushels to the acre, 45, 28, and 54. So that's a pretty broad range, and you farm, you know that fields can vary substantially from year to year. If that is your target, how do you predict it? Do you just use the average? Do you use the high? Do you use some combination of the best years? And that's where the models are trying to predict that yield. So there you're going to use soil variables, weather variables. Usually they don't incorporate nitrogen as a driver of yield, but they make recommendations based, again, on that targeted at the end of the season. So there's a lot of variability there, and if everything else was equal, you're basically talking about your end recommendation varying from year to year, plus or minus about 20 to 25 pounds of nitrogen per acre, or a range of about 40 to 50 pounds of N per acre. So that number has got, if we knew everything else, has a pretty big range just because of the fact we make different yields every year. And right now we're not great at predicting that. So I'll show you the results of a model. This model took into account the soil type, depth of rooting, the moisture characteristics of the soil, and then it used weather. And we didn't predict this. We actually waited till the end of the year and ran the model with the actual weather that was received. So we didn't have all the variability that would come in using, say, historical weather or forecast weather and how that would affect yield. And this particular model, which was sold commercially across 33 site years of data at these two best sites, so we added some more years beyond what I showed you in the previous figure. Maximum yield, or the optimum yield, the highest yield achieved, was predicted at 201 bushels per acre. And the actual average across all those site years was 204. Well, that's pretty good. I mean, that would be really great. On average, it's perfect. It's as good as picking your number. One number. Except the average is not always really indicative of what happens. So this is just each of those years, and this is the deviation in a particular year between the model result and the predicted yield from the model and the actual yield. So the actual yield was 30 plus bushels per acre more than the predicted yield, and 20, and then there were some sites where it was pretty close, and then here the predicted yield, actually the actual yield was actually less than the predicted yield. So on average it was great, and the person who developed the model said, wow, my model's really great. It was within a couple bushels of the true average, but that year-to-year variability is what we have to deal with. That's what we want to get better at. So unless that model could be modified over time to have a bunch of sites like this, it's not going to be really good in helping us making recommendations because it's going to be way off. If everything else was the same, we're going to end up 50 pounds of nitrogen short here and maybe over applying 30 pounds or so. So the good thing about models is they can get better. The bad thing about our average number is once we reach a certain number of experiments, it never gets better. It never can do a better job predicting what nitrogen's needed in a particular year or what the average yield is going to be. All right, so then one of the things that I was particularly interested in was that number, that 1.2 pounds of N per bushel, or in the tri-state, the 1.36 pounds of N per bushel. And so I participated in a study across the Corn Belt. We had eight states involved, and my graduate student was looking at what that N factor would be. It was conducted over 3 years. I'll show you more details later. But there ended up being 49 site years of data across those 3 years. And pounds of nitrogen per bushel. So the N factor was 1.2 in the least efficient location. So our least efficient corn needed 1.2 pounds in the above ground plant to make a bushel. That's what Stanford put forward in the 1960s, and it's a little bit less than what we used in the tri-state. The most efficient was around 0.8 of a pound of nitrogen per bushel. And in a way, that doesn't seem like a very big difference, but if you use 200 bushels per acre as your yield goal, the recommendation based on this N factor would be 240, and on this N factor it'd be 154. So that is a 85 pound difference in the N recommendation just due to the difference in efficiency of those plants, that particular field of corn, between the least and the most efficient. And on average, the number was about 0.9 of a pound of nitrogen per bushel. And Ignacio Ciampidi, who I think talked here a year or two ago maybe, he did a big study across the whole world, and he found it was, precisely on average about 1 pound of N per bushel. And of course, he had a huge amount of range in the value, similar to or greater than what we found. So you have uncertainty in predicting yield, and now this thing that we thought was constant, that never changed, is known to have quite a bit of variability as well. Assuming everything else held constant, you knew what yield was, that results in a variation of plus or minus about 40 pounds of nitrogen per acre as a recommendation. And the thing we were trying to do was see if that was predictable. And so we used a lot of weather data and soil property data, and we didn't find anything that was easily measured that was helpful in predicting what the efficiency would be of that field of corn or that plot of corn, so that we could anticipate what it would be. The only things that we found were harvesting and measuring the N content of the plant late during the vegetative growth stage. And the plants that had accumulated the most nitrogen at that time were going to be the least efficient. The plants that were on the lower end in nitrogen content when they were shoulder high turn out to be the more efficient plants. And we don't understand why that is. And that's something maybe we can measure with sensors late in the growing season, perhaps, is that nitrogen content. Okay, so mineralization of soil N. If you go back and look at the Indiana recommendations, again, they mention that on average soils provide some tiny little amount of nitrogen, and they subtract that little amount from the N recommendation. That mineralization of nitrogen is mostly results from microbial turnover of soil organic matter and crop residues, which is going to be highly influenced by temperature and moisture, which is going to be related to soil properties as well as weather. In some of our soils, we may actually get some ammonium released from the inner layer of 2-to-1 clays, like we see with potassium in some soils. Soil nitrogen can contribute a significant portion of the N accumulated by the crop in some soils. In Indiana, and I think it would be true in Ohio, there are very few soils that can provide all of the nitrogen needed to produce the optimum corn crop. Out of 250 trials, we've maybe had 1 or 2 where we don't think we got a response to adding nitrogen. This is a little different than what they see further west in the Corn Belt. And there are substantial differences that can arise from year to year. So how big do you think those differences in soil N contribution are? 50 pounds of N per acre, 100 pounds of N per acre, 200 pounds of N per acre. They can be substantial. So we've just estimated the nitrogen by measuring grain yield without any nitrogen fertilization. And we've assumed that 1 pound of N per bushel in the above ground plant. We didn't actually measure it. 101 corn after soybean trials peaking out at about 180 bushels to the acre, or maybe about 180 pounds of N per bushel, all the way down to a 12 bushel per acre on one of those eastern Indiana poorly drained Blount Pewamo landscapes. So we are talking about a 180 pound difference in soil N contribution due to soil types and years. This real poor soil, sometimes we measure 50 pounds contributed by the soil. These better soils can easily range between 70 and 150, depending on the season. So again, a lot of variability, and it makes it hard to find the number, because the number changes every year. So there is some interest. I know Steve Coleman's working on some tests to look at the contribution of organic matter. And in this trial that was conducted across the Corn Belt, a grad student, Mac Bean, looked at CO2 evolution. This happened to be a 4-day test. They found a 1-day test was highly correlated, and looked at the relationship between this carbon dioxide that is evolved and the economic optimum N rate from that the MRTN approach. So this CO2 is a reflection of the microbial activity and the organic matter that's likely to be mineralized and release nitrogen during the growing season. And the first year he started with was 2016, and he was really excited. The more microbial activity, the more CO2, the less nitrogen was needed to reach that economic optimum N rate. And as that CO2 was lower, less microbial activity, it required a higher rate of nitrogen. And it actually explained about 50% of the variation in economic optimum nitrogen rate, which is really pretty good. Most of what we're trying to do, we're only explaining about 50% of the variation in yield or less. He then moved on to the 2 previous years' worth of samples, and there's essentially very little relationship. And this technique, like most, is not just helpful in a single season, but it really has to work across seasons. And you see here it's just a mishmash really no good usable relationship. So yes, soluble organic matter, mineralizable, and microbial activity is important, but a single measurement at the beginning of the season is not likely to give much information on how much nitrogen is going to be needed that year. And for the main reason is because temperature and moisture and other factors in the soil will affect how much of that nitrogen gets released and utilized by the plant. So I want to talk a little bit about nitrogen mineralization. This is actually a student from Ohio State that came, Megan Mosier, that came and did a master's degree at Purdue. And she was interested in nitrogen mineralization, and we had 6 locations in a corn-soybean rotation that we had fertilized the same plots with as little as 25 pounds of N per acre per year up to 280 pounds of N per acre per year. So we had a full response curve across that wide range. So after 5 years of corn, these plots would have had 1,400 pounds of nitrogen per acre. And we wanted to see if we had depleted the soil of nitrogen by the low rates and the moderate rates, or if we had built it up with the high rates. So we just put a little starter nitrogen out to get the plant started, and we assessed the soil and mineralization by harvesting the plant at the end of the year and measuring the nitrogen in that plant. At planting time, she sampled the soil down to a depth of 2 feet in 3 layers, and she took it into the lab and she did a nitrogen mineralization potential. So she put the soil in containers and kept them at optimum temperature and moisture, and then measured the nitrogen release over time. So this is what occurred in the field. You can see this little inset here. We had a full rate of nitrogen across 3 reps here with a 0. You can see the single line. And these are the plots that had previously got between 0 and 280 pounds of nitrogen per acre. There'd be 6 individual rates there. But in this year, they just got 25 at planting. And you see they didn't do too good. They're pretty yellow, okay? A little bit nitrogen deficient. And this is the nitrogen that those plants took up. So that wonderful prairie soil, the plants accumulated about 30 pounds of N per acre. That really poor soil in eastern Indiana is down around less than 8. I think it was 6 bushels to the acre. And then when we measured the plant N content, it was about 8 pounds per acre. Some other locations in Indiana, all the way up to about 60 pounds per acre. And people always say, well, look, organic matter will tell you this. If you look here, you'll see these 2 highest had 2.7 and 2.8% organic matter. These 2 lowest had 3.6 and 4.0%. So not the relationship you anticipated. These higher ones were actually in the field delivering less nitrogen. So in the laboratory, things are a little different, right? When you take a soil out of the laboratory, you mix it up. It's not subject to that drainage or lack of drainage that occurs in the field. And so the results, when we looked at it in the laboratory, we have lots of mineralization. This is in parts per million. So if you looked at the upper 8 inches of soil or so and wanted to convert it to pounds per acre, you would double these numbers. So in the field, we found 6 to 60 pounds taken up by the plants. In the laboratory, we found 250 to 400 pounds of nitrogen released. Remember, every percent organic matter has 1,000 pounds of nitrogen. So how much of that's released and acquired by the plant is really the key, even in low organic matter soils, not how much is actually there to begin with. So if you just compare, here you see this soil that was really poor in the field, didn't mineralize quite a bit in the laboratory. That's a really poorly drained, tight soil. In the field, it's wet a lot of the time. When you put it in the cup under ideal conditions, it had a lot of nitrogen to mineralize because of all that organic matter. Here, this particular soil in the field released the most or nitrogen, but in the laboratory it was one of the least. And so this measurement of nitrogen release that we might do with CO2 or permanganate or an incubation is not necessarily going to translate into what happens in the field. And it's going to be different every year depending on the weather. If you go back and look, this fella Stanford again took a bunch of soils and he looked at mineralization as related to water content. And you see here we've marked field capacity, and this is dry and this is excessively wet. And he found with most soils, particularly when they're heavier textured, this mineralization is optimized in a very narrow range, somewhere around field capacity. So when it's too dry, we're cognizant of that. We don't get mineralization. But also when it's too wet, mineralization is also slowed pretty substantially. And, yeah. Some of those, 2 of those fields are no-till. One is ridge-till, and the rest are plowed, not rolling cultivator or chisel plowed, depending on the season. Say that again, please. Yeah, so the question is, did we see any differences among those different systems? They're very different soils, as well as having different tillage. So we didn't have anything where we had tillage treatments within a similar soil. At one of those sites, they have a long-term tillage experiment for 50 years, and they found after 50 years, then they had some unfertilized plots, and they found no difference in nitrogen release between the no-till, chisel plow, and moldboard plow treatments. So one of the things that Megan Mosier did was look at the saturated hydraulic conductivity, which is how well these soils drain. And the poorly drained soils had very low yields with starter only, and the better drained had higher yields. So I guess this feeds back into the idea that the amount of mineralized nitrogen is not only dependent on how much is there in organic matter, but what the moisture relations are of that soil, and how well water moves through the soil. She also found for 3 of the sites, when we modeled excess water, so water above what the plant needed to transpire during the growing season, in these 3 poorly drained soils, that the yields decreased proportionally with the increase in excess water. So that could affect mineralization as well as nitrogen loss. But again, it shows how important it is not only to find out what the potential is, but how the weather and soil properties change that potential. All right, and that's what I say on this slide. So in the experiments that were done across the Corn Belt. One of the fellows was a modeler, and he found that knowing what the water table depth was in the spring and the moisture holding capacity of the soil above the water table was an excellent predictor of how much nitrogen needed to be added. So the poorly drained soils that had shallow spring water tables and limited rooting in wetter conditions required higher application rates of nitrogen to optimize yield. And the soils that were less poorly drained, where the water table was deeper early in the season, required much less nitrogen. The size of the point represents the amount of sand. So you have silt loam soils that are well drained here, where the optimum N rate is not that high, and then silt loam soils here that are very poorly drained, that had much higher nitrogen rates requirements. And again, somewhere around 50% of the variation in this case, economic optimum N rate, could be explained by just these variables here that you can get from either Sergo or you can measure clay content. All right, so difficulty with yield goal-based method. We've tested some models that haven't performed really well, and our states have gone to this corn nitrogen rate calculator, the MRTN approach. And do I go to 11:30 or 11:45? Okay, all right, perfect. So in Indiana, and I think Robert Mullen started and maybe Steve followed up, we built a database of nitrogen responses on our Purdue farms and farmers' fields. So we've done close to a couple hundred of these. Half of them are on Purdue farms, half of them are with farmers. And we've typically used 5 or 6 N rates, replicated 4 to 6 times. So you hear in southeast Indiana, you can see the 0 N rate and maybe a 40, and then the higher N rates, et cetera. So aggregating these results, we've come out with an average recommendation, and it can be gotten from that nitrogen rate calculator that everybody always attributes to Iowa, or in Indiana we have the guidelines in an extension leaflet that can be downloaded from the internet. So that's the approach that we're using, and I'm going to go back to this 8-state study and talk about their evaluation of the different tools for making nitrogen rate recommendations and how they performed across this region over a 3-year period. These experiments were small plot trials. They weren't large. They had 8 nitrogen rates ranging from 0 to 280 pounds of N per acre in 40-pound increments. The nitrogen was broadcast applied at planting or at V9, and that timing didn't matter much. There's a little advantage to the V9 application. Now remember, this is a wide geography. North Dakota, Nebraska, all the way to Indiana. So there's a lot of difference in rainfall and soil types. So, the general findings may not fit specifically to the Eastern Corn Belt. So you can see here just an example of all the N rates, and we fit the relationship and predicted the economic optimum. And they also looked at estimated the amount of nitrogen lost during the growing season based on plant measurements and some modeling. The nitrogen recommendations tested were the yield goal, the MRTN, the calculator, pre-sidrous nitrate test, an active optical sensor, so the Optrix from Crop Circle or Holland. Ag Leader today, thanks. A plant growth model, maize N, and the farmer's choice. Now, most of the farmers in this study were experiment station superintendents for universities, so they chose the N rate, which should be pretty close to what the university recommends, but I won't guarantee it for the other states. It definitely was for Indiana, though. And then we made a whole lot of measurements there. All right, so this just, and there were many versions of each of these tools, usually state-specific, and I just picked the generic ones. So in all of these figures, this color blue is the yield goal, this is the calculator method, the pre-sidrous nitrate test, the farmer's choice, the model, and the sensor. Asterisks here, only a couple of those states don't use MRTN, so they couldn't have an MRTN recommendation. So there were only 36 site years where this was evaluated versus 49 for all the rest. And this is on the bottom here, they were grouped into 3 categories, where the difference between the predicted and the actual economic optimum N rate in pounds per acre. So how different was the prediction from what actually occurred after the fact? And this percentage of soils where the difference was less than 27 pounds of N per acre. So for instance, the yield goal predicted had 18% sites where they predicted close to the optimum. The MRTN had over 40, the PSNT had over 40, the farmer's choice was around 30, the model that we chose was less than 15, and the sensor was about 45. Now again, the farmer choice would have been MRTN, for PSNT, would have either been MRTN or yield goal modified by the PSNT measurement. So the starting point would have either been, like Nebraska would have been yield goal, Indiana would have been MRTN. We'll just skip over here to the last category. This is where the tool was more than 54 pounds off from what the optimum, either below or above. And you see the yield goal, 65% of the time was off by 54 or more, and the model also. Now, they have similar magnitude of error, but the error was in the opposite direction. So the model tended to underestimate yield, and this is dollars lost relative to if you knew beforehand what the end result was. So if you and God were on a great relationship and she told you what the answer was, you couldn't do any better than that. So you're always losing money compared to the optimum. So the model was terrible. This particular model just underestimated the nitrogen requirement. The sensor here was moderately less than perfect. Yield goal, PSNT, the farmer, and then the MRTN. And these bars mean the profit didn't vary across these treatments. Really, the only treatment that stood out as being bad in this case was the particular maize N model that we utilized. They also looked at the environmental costs, so the estimate of nitrogen loss to the environment, and you see that most of these were less were negative to the environment, so the yield goal, which over-applied nitrogen and the nitrogen was lost, or the farmer or MRTN application. PSNT and sensor were really close to the optimum, and the model actually benefited the environment because it recommended so little nitrogen that the losses were less. From this work and other aspects of it, we found that as long as you were no more than about 30 pounds over the true optimum, the impact on the environment was not detectable, so it was small. So from other work, we think this within 30 pounds of nitrogen per acre is going to be a pretty good point to shoot for. That as long as we're in that ballpark, we're not going to increase our impact on the environment, and our profitability is going to be near the maximum. So this work is continuing, and what we're finding is that we can put 2 or 3 of these approaches together and improve those recommendations, so we can increase the predictability 10 to 25% by combining weather with the sensor, or the anaerobic mineralization predictions at the beginning of the year with weather, or using the PSNT together with the mineralizable end predictions as well. And I think one of the things that would be nice would be to evaluate some of the other models that are available, or to develop a model from some of the results of these studies. So with that, there's my summary. You can write that one down, Josh. Don't attribute it to me, though. Oh, okay. So I'm sorry that there's so much variability in nitrogen, but hopefully you understand it better, and maybe you can look towards some of these tools. One thing I'd like to just say, PSNT really showed up pretty well. In our area of the world, we don't recommend it be used unless you have a legume cover crop or alfalfa, or use manure. And that's because most of the time we find the soil nitrate to be less than 10 parts per million, which is where we give a full recommendation anyway. And we rarely find higher accumulations, and certainly not many outside those situations with 25 parts per million where you would recommend no additional N fertilizer. So perhaps in rotations that have more potential to carry over nitrogen, we might be able to improve what we're doing with a PSNT measurement, even if we're not using manure or plowing down clover or something like that. So with that, I think we have a few minutes for questions. Yes? Okay. The question was, what about a tissue sample? And we did not do anything with tissue sampling. So I don't know. Sorry, at the back. Right, so the comment was the sensors did their job, and economically, and were good for the environment, and that would be a good conclusion from this work. We did delay our side dressing to V9 because we wanted to be able to pick up differences between the unfertilized and the well-fertilized strip. So it puts you kind of at the end of when you can use conventional side dressing equipment to put out nitrogen. So it may require that you have high clearance equipment, which was not figured into the cost.